Something that I grapple with a lot, and I've done so on camera with you all many, many times, is the way that it seems so many Americans have omitted from their memory a crucial 2 years. The worst of the pandemic, many people have just left out of their memory as they analyze politics. And while that seems notable, but not universally consequential for this current election, it is actually. And so many implications come of people choosing, for reasons that, as I look into the psychology of it, make more sense, to try to forget that time, thus not applying it to their analysis of this election. So I'll explain what I mean for those of you who haven't heard me make these points before, but there's a new piece out from Mother Jones that is really well done and really interesting, which talks about what is honestly, given how important the stakes of this election are, is a really horrifying thing that's happening to America, but there's something real. It's affirming to have explained by experts, memory experts, psychologists, a phenomenon that I've tried to explain to all of you in layman's terms that I know is happening, but I don't know how real it is in people's brains, but it's real. You see this piece titled "Millions Have Amnesia" about the worst of Trump's presidency. Memory experts explain why. I'll try to remember to link it below. And if you want to read the whole thing, because I won't have a chance to read even a large portion of it here, you can do it. But here's the first paragraph. One of the most oft-quoted sentences ever penned by a philosopher is George Santayana's observation that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. In 2024, this aphorism is practically a campaign slogan. Donald Trump, seeking to become the first former president since Grover Cleveland to return to the White House after being voted out of the job, has waged war on remembrance. In fact, he's depending on tens of millions of voters forgetting the recent past. This election is an experiment in how powerful a memory hole can be. And let's just jump down to this part. In August, Will Cornell, Medical College psychiatrist George McCary, and Richard Freeman argued in the New England Journal of Medicine that a collective inability among many people in the United States to remember and mourn what was endured during the pandemic could help explain why, in early 2024, half of Americans told pollsters they were no better off than they had been at the height of the deadliest epidemic in the country's history. A big part of the Trump campaign message is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Because they think you're going to say no, and that must be Biden-Harris's fault. But if you remember where we were 4 years ago, as was mentioned here, at the height of the deadliest epidemic in the country's history, then of course you would think we're better off. But there's as consequential takeaways from that analysis that we'll get to that people forget. They likened the finding to classic studies, the article continues, by German social psychiatrists that explored how many post-World War II Germans had seemingly lost the ability to acknowledge the atrocities. McCary points out that chronic trauma and stress can inhibit memory, and the pandemic yielded much of both. In addition, he says, psychologically, this loss of memory is compounded by defenses against helplessness. Finally, socially, this is all made worse by collective amnesia. No one wants to remember how terrifying that first year was before tests, before vaccines. I can barely recall. So from biological, psychological, and social points of views, we grow hazy. Again, affirming. Because I've felt a little crazy going, when I talk to people about politics, it's not a part of the analysis that we had to first get out of the crisis, first deal with all the supply chain problems, first deal with what was inevitable inflation as we saw worldwide that Biden-Harris has had to deal with, first deal with the public health epidemic. But that's not a part of people's analysis. It's Trump was president, 2019, skip over some years there, pick up when we were recovered-ish, but still a lot of problems lingering. And it made me feel crazy. Many of you probably as well. But there's a real phenomenon there. We are so appreciative of the thousands and thousands of people who've been subscribing every single day. So let's keep it going. Our race to 1 million subscribers. We're getting so close. Any of you who haven't already, please do click that subscribe button. Back to the video. In a way, the author continues, this is a mechanical issue. The basic function of memory allows for or even facilitates such forgetting, says William Hurst, a New School for Social Research psychology professor. When you recall the past, you do so selectively. Trump people do that selectively with his agenda in mind, as Hurst puts it. A narrative that leaves out information induces forgetting of the unmentioned material. You might think that normally if you don't mention something, it slowly fades. It's much more dynamic than that. Talking about other parts of the story actively leads people to forget what is not discussed. So it talks about the horrors of COVID, violence at the Capitol. Those things are being suppressed because, yes, Trump and MAGA pushing a narrative that leaves out those things, but also mainstream media is not bringing it back into people's frontal cortex enough. I probably scream more than anyone about the way that we're forgetting the context of what was inherited by Biden-Harris. But there are a lot of people making that point, but it's not being brought into people's lives and minds and political analysis enough. And there's a very real reason for this. We all were traumatized by that, some more than others, some losing, so many losing, with over 1 million deaths just in the United States. Losing family and friends. Not to mention the economic impact of the pandemic. And in a way of trying to heal, which with different types of trauma makes total sense, we've just sort of suppressed and pushed out of our mind that. But then what does that do? It allows Trump's narrative to perfectly fit because he only wants you to remember up until the pandemic. One last part from this, and then we'll move on from this just into my analysis. 4 years prior, the COVID pandemic was raging, the economy was cratering, deaths were mounting, and anxiety was at a fever pitch. Trump responded erratically, downplaying the threat, pushing conspiracy theories, and undermining scientific officials and public health recommendations. In parentheses, it says bleach. In the final year of his presidency, more than 450,000 Americans died of COVID. A Lancet study concluded the U.S. death rate was 40% higher than in similar countries, and that many of those deaths could have been averted had Trump handled the crisis responsibly. And his own former medical top officials have said the same. So this is not a joke. This is not things Trump could have done better around the edges. He fundamentally effed up the response because he didn't want to take it seriously because he thought that would cause people to blame him for things not going well because of the pandemic. So he downplayed it for far too long. Slow the testing down is a quote of his. Obviously him trying to pontificate about his own ideas of how things could be solved, like disinfect it, instead of just taking the advice of medical professionals. And so try to think just for a moment back to that, the worst of that. Why we fired him. Harris said that 81 million people fired him. Why? It was because of that. Mostly for people. And after that, then he waged a war against our democracy by engaging in what prosecutors have deemed to be illegal activity to prevent Biden from coming into office, leading to a bloody attack on the Capitol. That was such an anxiety-inducing time, a frightening, uncertain time. Is Trump not going to leave office? I remember, in addition to the fact that while we were just thinking, is our democracy going to survive? Meanwhile, thousands of our fellow Americans were dying every day. And we didn't have a president taking it seriously because he was too caught up in how he was going to keep himself in office even though he lost. No wonder, so that we don't have to simmer in that any longer, we're going to pretend like it didn't happen. But what does that do to our analysis? You've heard it before. Two major things. It removes from Trump's record the the time when he most needed to be a leader and he showed America he couldn't. So all people are remembering right now, because of this collective amnesia, that psychiatrists and psychologists, goodness, both they are identifying as a real psychological phenomenon, that collective amnesia that we're having. It leaves out what was the time when we saw, oh, this guy can't be president. Because when something actually happens that is globally a crisis, unlike the pretty good situation he inherited from Obama, once S actually hit the fan, he couldn't be a leader. That's why we fired him, but we removed that. So it benefits Trump because it removes from people's record, or people's memory, the worst part of his record, as well as his attack on our democracy. But then it also benefits Trump over in a different category by hindering people's analysis of the Biden-Harris record. Because if you include completely the context of the pandemic, you both remember how terrible of a leader Trump was and the hundreds of thousands of people who died because of the mishandling of that pandemic, how crime spiked in historic proportions, higher than it had to because of his mishandling. The economy suffered more than it had to because of his mishandling. You remember that in this category. Category 2, though, is you don't remember, or I should flip it around because I think I started with if you do. If you do remember, then you remember that that's what Biden-Harris had to inherit. That everything was in such a tough spot that it's remarkable we've gotten from there, outpaced every other country in our super strong recovery from there, crime going from super high to super low. Meanwhile, one historic piece of legislation after another being implemented, huge infrastructure investments, finally addressing high prescription drug costs for seniors, finally expanding health coverage for our veterans, not to mention the American Rescue Plan being a part of that recovery, investing in American manufacturing, and that with the context of what they had to pick up the pieces of also gives you a more accurate and thus positive view on the Biden-Harris record. Looking at how the whole world dealt with the pandemic and pandemic-related inflation gives you more understanding of why maybe the Trump talking points about how everything affordability-related is Biden-Harris's fault probably aren't accurate, etc. So if you can forget the worst of Trump's and forget not the best of Biden-Harris's, but the proper context for theirs, then yeah, maybe Trump seems better than he actually is. And that is what this very real thing is that people are allowing to happen in their mind. And while it seems like this is sort of pie in the sky, super cerebral, just a fun thinking thing, thought experiment, it's not. This is so real, because if we allow people to continue doing something that is in the interest of their emotional stability, because it's blocking out the most painful part of the last few years for us, it's not in the interest of accurately analyzing our current political moment. And given how we more rapidly got inflation under control than a lot of our counterparts, even the big economic point that's real and painful that is brought up by MAGA isn't correctly being assessed by people, because they're not seeing that the problem you can't really judge Biden-Harris for, given it being pandemic related. The solution, their attempt to solve it, you can't. I think I'll leave it there. I'm curious to hear what you all think in the comments on that one. I know it's quite the upsetting thing if you haven't forgotten, but it's playing a huge role in this election. It could make the difference, because that's their big thing. 4 years ago was so great. No, it wasn't. Remind people, please.